My kids organized a dinner and they didn't invite me. While they toasted, I stayed at home, in front of an empty table, waiting for an invitation that never arrived. But what I did next turned that night into something no one would ever forget. I've always thought that solitude was louder than any crowd. That night, that was exactly what I felt. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its merciless ticking, and each second seemed to poke at my weary soul. I sat in the old kitchen chair, staring at the empty table, and I realized how the silence had become almost unbearable. There were no voices, no laughter, only the insistent memory of everything I'd already experienced. Every moment, my mind drifted back to my youth. I remembered when the house was full of hustle and bustle, toys scattered across the floor, the smell of cakes in the oven. I barely had time to rest, but I never complained. I found it beautiful to see my children growing up, even if it meant giving up on myself. Today, the contrast of silence hurts more than the pains in my body. It's as if the walls remind me, you are no longer needed. That night, even the wind seemed to mock me. It blew past the window, making the wood of the frame creak like an ironic laugh. I tried to distract myself by folding dish towels, but my hands were shaking. Not from age, but from emptiness. Anyone who has been surrounded by life feels the weight of abandonment like someone carrying a stone on their chest. I wondered, at what point did solitude stop being a choice and become a punishment? I stared down the dark hallway and remembered the nights I'd stay awake waiting for my children to come home from school or work. I always left the living room light on, believing that a lit house warded off danger. Now, that same light only served to illuminate my absence. The light burned, but it didn't warm. My heart, however, was frozen. I went to the window. I saw the empty street, the street lamp illuminating the sidewalk wet with a fine drizzle. And I thought, how many mothers, like me, look outside, hoping for a gesture of remembrance? How many feel the same lump in their throat, the same emptiness in their stomach? The loneliness isn't just mine. It belongs to all the women who gave everything and were then forgotten. But in that moment, even knowing this, the pain seemed to be mine alone. I picked up an old album from the sideboard and opened it carefully. The pages creaked as if complaining of age. There were yellowed photos of birthdays, simple celebrations, but full of smiles. I saw myself young, with a flowery apron and eyes shining with pride. It was as if that smiling woman had died, and I was just the shadow that remained. Leafing through those memories hurt more than it comforted me. The silence of the house continued to suffocate me. There was no pan on the stove, no scent of seasoning, but my mind insisted on recreating these smells as if they were ghosts. I could almost hear the creaking of the pan, the sound of chairs being pulled out, the conversations that passed between us. And then, suddenly, everything fell apart. The emptiness returned, more cruel. It was like waking from a good dream only to fall into a nightmare. I sat back down at the table. I ran my hand over the tablecloth, which still held the soft scent of fabric softener. I caressed the fabric as if it were skin, as if it could replace the human touch I lacked. I sighed deeply and thought, do they remember me now? Did they mention my name at least once amidst their conversations and plans? But there was no answer. Silence always prevailed. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to my own breathing. It was a hoarse, tired sound, full of pauses. I was almost startled to realize that this was the only sound that truly kept me company. Then I understood. When even the sound of my own breath becomes a solace, it's because loneliness has become a dwelling. And it was in this deafening emptiness that I realized that night wouldn't be like the others. There was something different, a silent calling within me. I couldn't explain it, but I sensed that destiny was about to push me out of this house, beyond the walls that imprisoned me. And even as fear gripped me, an ancient flame began to ignite. I started with the tablecloth, as I've always done my whole life. I spread the white fabric with tiny flowers and smoothed every corner with the palm of my hand, like someone calming a skittish animal. Why all this care, if perhaps no one would come? Because care is the last thing I have left. I weighed the salt down on the edge, so the tablecloth wouldn't move. The tablecloth was firm. My heart was pounding. It's strange how we set the table when, inside, everything is a mess. I picked out the plates, one by one, running my finger along the edges, remembering where they came from. This one was bought with my 13th month's salary, that one, with coins counted at the end of the month. There are scratches, there are scuffs, there is history. And I, who have always accepted the marks of time on the dishes, still struggled to accept the marks of time on myself. Why is it easier to forgive a plate than to forgive memories? Maybe because the plate doesn't respond. The silverware clinked in the drawer like timid bells. I placed forks on the left, knives on the right, spoons across the table as if promising dessert. The sound of metal gave me a kind of courage. I opened the china cabinet and blew the dust off 2 tall glasses, imagining toasts that might not exist. To the family, I would murmur. And the echo, would it toast back? I didn't turn on the stove, but I did rekindle memories. I smelled the garlic browning even without a pan, heard the beans bubbling even without water. The mind is a tricky thing. It cooks what doesn't exist, serves what doesn't arrive. I sliced the silence with an imaginary knife, as if I could season absence with parsley. And I asked myself, who taught solitude to be such a good cook? Solitude knows how to make banquets out of nothing. I grabbed my phone and turned up the ringer, just in case. I placed it in the center of the table, as if it were an honored guest. I thought about writing, "I'm here," but deleted it before sending it. Who asks for an invitation to their own home? Who asks for a souvenir for their own children? I swallowed the question with a sip of water and left the glass half empty, like someone leaving hope half empty. I pulled out the chairs and lined them up meticulously, an old habit from when I was still in command. I would sit at this end. Beside me, the laughter I'd invented. I imagined a coat thrown over the back, a crumpled napkin, breadcrumbs telling a lively conversation. How can we see so much life where there's only emptiness? Maybe it's a mother's instinct. Maybe it's stubbornness. I opened the window to let in air, and a wisp of drizzle that smelled of the street drifted in. I closed it immediately, chuckling to myself at my exaggeration. You're going to catch a cold, woman, I told myself, as if I still had someone to care for. I remembered the harsh winters, the thick soups, the bread divided into 4. Nothing I served was too much, but it was always whole. All of me, all of my time, all of my love. I returned to the table and folded the cloth napkins into little boats, a silly habit I'd done to make them laugh when they were little. A little boat for every absence. A little boat for every promise that didn't make it to port. I ran my hand over them and felt an overwhelming urge to say, "Hurry up, the soup's getting cold." But there was no soup. There was only cold. I glanced at the clock. The hours flowed by like water from a poorly closed faucet. Plim, plim, plim. Each minute was a clean dish that I soiled inside. I went to the sink, washed a glass unnecessarily, dried it unnecessarily, put it away unnecessarily. Is there anything more tiring than trying to fool time? Is there anything sadder than discovering that time can't be fooled? Before turning off the kitchen light, I left a small candle lit in the center of the table. Not to illuminate what I saw, but to warm what I felt. And I promised myself I would wait a little longer, just a little longer, because hope always requires 5 more minutes. Little did I know that outside, the night was preparing other places, other lights, and other gazes for me. And that candle, so simple, would be the sign that my path, even today, remained lit. The clock struck 7, and my heart raced, as if expecting a surprise at any moment. I kept my eye on the phone on the table, convinced it would vibrate with a message. "Mom, we're on our way." But the device remained still, silent, as if mocking my anticipation. It's strange how such a small object can carry such great hope. I looked out the window and saw the streetlights flashing, cars passing slowly, entire families crossing the sidewalk for dinners that weren't mine. I imagined every restaurant door opening, every table filled with conversation, every mother smiling at her children. And I, inside my house, waited for the invitation that never came. The world seemed whole, except for my own little piece. I picked up the phone, intending to call. My finger hovered over one of their names, but I hesitated. What would I say? Have they forgotten me? The phrase sounded bitter, even childish. So I put the phone back on the table and sighed. Better to keep quiet, I thought. Better to wait. I've always believed that people remember sooner or later, but sometimes too late is too late. As I waited, memories intruded. I remembered when they were teenagers and would make excuses to get out of family dinners. "Mom, I can't make it today, I already made plans," they'd say. I feigned understanding, but it hurt. And now, so many years later, the excuse didn't even come. This time, there was no lie, no justification. There was just silence. A silence that cut like a blade. I felt a pang in my chest, but it wasn't just pain, it was disappointment. I ran my hand over the stretched tablecloth, as if caressing a sick body. The table seemed to ask me, "Are you going to keep waiting?" And I answered in my mind, "Yes, I will." Because a mother's heart doesn't know how to give up. It persists even when pride tells it to stop. The hours passed, and each minute without news seemed to mock my naivete. The candle I had lit slowly melted, forming a pool of wax that reminded me of the times I, too, had melted inside. I stood there, watching the flickering flame, asking myself, do any of them think of me now? I tried to distract myself by picking up another photo album. I saw birthdays, weddings, baptisms. I saw myself in every corner, holding a plate, adjusting a dress, applauding achievements. Always me in the background, always me supporting. And I realized that, in every photo, there was a sparkle in the eyes of others, but my sparkle was just a reflection. I was there, but almost invisible. I returned to the table and stared at the lined chairs. I imagined each one arriving, taking off their coats, kissing me on the cheek, asking for my blessing. I even felt the weight of a made-up hug. Imagination has these things. It delivers crumbs when life denies us banquets. But I knew they were just shadows. Reality was before me, and it silently screamed that I wasn't expected. At 9 o'clock, hope began to fade. I found myself leaning over the table, hands clasped together, as if in prayer. I asked God to give me patience, to give me strength to not let myself be broken by abandonment. But I also asked for signs, any sign, that there was still room for me in their lives. No sign came. No message, no call. It was there, in that cruel void, that I realized the invitation would not come. There was no innocent forgetfulness, no delay. It was a choice. And when absence becomes a choice, it weighs more than 1,000 rejections. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. And in that moment, between pain and lucidity, I began to feel a strange courage within me, a courage born from the wound itself. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the candle's nearly extinguished flame. Silence enveloped me, heavy as a wet blanket. For a moment, I considered accepting it as fate. Maybe that's what it was. A mother serves while she's useful, and then becomes a museum piece. It hurt to think that way, but the pain was mixed with a kind of bitter resignation, like someone drinking medicine knowing it stings, but is the only way forward. As I stroked the towel aimlessly, old scenes came to mind. I remembered the first time one of my sons said, "I don't need you for anything." It was an outburst of adolescence, full of youthful rage. I smiled on the outside, but inside, the phrase pierced like a knife. That night, I cried into my pillow. And now, so many years later, it was as if those words echoed again, stronger than ever. The memory brought forth others. I saw my own image, younger, waking up at dawn to sew clothes just to have extra money at the end of the month. I remembered my calloused hands, the smell of fabric, and my tired eyes. But what sustained me was always the thought that my children would look at me with gratitude. And there, before the empty table, I wondered, had it all been in vain? I closed my eyes and heard the laughter of childhood. I heard the sound of mugs hitting the table, the confusion of voices asking for bread, milk, cake. The memory was so vivid that for a moment I thought they were actually arriving. I opened my eyes quickly, but only saw the empty chair staring back at me, as if mocking my hope. Loneliness is cruel. First it feeds, then it tears me down. Resignation seemed the most logical path. Accepting that times have changed, that I'm no longer a priority, that my children have lives of their own. But there was a stubborn voice inside me, insisting that I'm not just a shadow. This voice, fragile and firm at the same time, told me, "You still have value." And it was this voice that kept me from falling apart completely. I ran my hands over my face, trying to blink away the tears that insisted on falling. With each drop, it was as if a piece of my patience was being drained away. I thought about how many times I'd swallowed a frog, how many times I'd remained silent in the face of small ingratitudes. How many times I'd told myself, "They're still young, they'll grow up." But now they were adults, and yet they still hadn't learned. Looking at the portraits on the wall, I saw myself from years ago. Young, determined, full of plans. I felt a kind of indignation rise. How could that woman, who had given so much, who had sacrificed so much, now be reduced to an empty weight? The contrast hurt. It was as if I had become a supporting character in my own story. And yet, there was also tenderness. Because, even hurt, I couldn't bring myself to wish them harm. Mothers are like that. They suffer, but they never stop loving. Pain doesn't erase affection. It only makes it more silent, more hidden. It's a love that screams on the inside while remaining silent on the outside. I took a deep breath and said to myself, almost in a whisper, maybe it's time to stop waiting for them to come to me. Maybe it's time to go to them myself. The phrase echoed through the room like a decision. Still not fully brave, but with the spark lit. And in that moment, between resignation and remembrance, I realized I was at a crossroads. Either I accepted the role of ghost in my own house, or I rose to show that I still existed. And it was this second thought that began to throb, like a dull drumbeat announcing that something was about to change. I stood up slowly, as if carrying an invisible weight on my shoulders. The cold kitchen floor seemed to want to hold me down, but my stubborn feet continued forward. I walked to the hallway mirror and stared at the woman before me. Her gray hair, tied haphazardly, wrinkles marking every renunciation. And yet, in my tired eyes, there was a living spark. It was then that I realized I wouldn't let loneliness win that night. I took a deep breath, adjusted my coat over my shoulders, and put on lipstick, a small, almost childish gesture, but one that reminded me that I could still feel worthy. I smiled slightly, even though my heart was breaking. It wasn't vanity, it was resistance. Because a mother can be forgotten, but she doesn't have to accept being erased. Looking in the mirror was like signing a pact with myself. I would go, with or without an invitation. I returned to the table and observed the tablecloth stretched out, the silverware lined up, the glasses gleaming, waiting for no one. For a moment, I considered undoing everything, but I didn't have the courage. I left the table set as it was, as if it were a silent witness to my decision. That empty table would be a reminder of what I refused to accept, a reminder that one shouldn't wait forever for someone who's already forgotten. I grabbed my bag, feeling the light weight inside. Wallet, keys, nothing else. It wasn't what I carried on my shoulders that weighed me down, but what I carried in my heart. I opened the door slowly, and the cold draft sent shivers down my spine. It was as if the world outside was challenging me. Do you have the courage? I closed my eyes for a second and silently replied, yes, I do. Out on the street, the wind carried the scent of rain and wet asphalt. The streetlights seemed to illuminate a path just for me. Each step I took echoed on the pavement like hammer blows, marking the rhythm of a wounded but steadfast heart. I didn't look back. I knew that if I did, I would see loneliness beckoning through the window. And I didn't want to hesitate. As I walked, I recalled other silent decisions in my life. Like when I decided to raise my children alone, even though I had nothing but my own hands. Or when I took menial jobs just to put food on the table. I always walked in silence, but I always walked. And now would be no different. The courage that drove me was the same as before, only more hardened. The streets were nearly deserted, but I wasn't afraid. On the contrary, there was a strange sense of freedom. Every corner seemed to say, there are still paths. And I believed it. Because if there's one thing life has taught me, it's that we only truly grow old when we stop moving. And that night, despite the pain, I was moving. Deep down, I knew I wasn't just going for dinner. I was going for respect, for recognition, for a place that had always been rightfully mine. Maybe they wouldn't understand. Maybe they'd look at me with astonishment. But I had to go. Because a mother can be forgotten, but she should never forget herself. My steps slowed as I saw the restaurant lights in the distance. My heart raced, a mix of anxiety and defiance. There were my children, gathered together, laughing, living, and excluding me. But from then on, I would no longer be a shadow. I would enter. I would be seen. And it was like that, without saying a word, just with the echo of my footsteps and the flame in my chest, that I decided that night would not be marked by oblivion. It would be marked by the silent courage of a mother. When I turned the last corner, there it was, the restaurant lit up, its glass windows reflecting the activity inside. I paused for a few seconds, like someone facing a mountain before climbing it. My eyes wandered over the shiny facade, the warm lights that seemed to invite everyone except me. And it was in this contrast that I felt courage throb even more strongly within my chest. The muffled sound of conversation and laughter drifted through the glass and reached me, like background music reminding me of what I'd lost. I approached slowly, feeling the chill of the night mixed with the heat of anticipation. It was strange. The closer I got, the heavier the door seemed. Not because of the material, but because of its meaning. Opening that door was more than just entering a restaurant. It was trespassing into the realm of oblivion. My fingers trembled as I touched the doorknob. I considered backing away, considered going home and pretending nothing had happened. But the memory of the empty table, the melted candle, the lonely chairs wouldn't let me give up. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes for a moment, and told myself, you didn't come this far to turn back. As I pushed open the door, a delicious aroma hit me. Roasting meat, freshly baked bread, spices dancing in the air. It was the kind of smell that always made me think of family. But that night, the smell of food only reinforced the hunger I felt not in my stomach, but in my soul. The hunger to be remembered. I took a few steps inside. The noise grew louder, silverware clanging, laughter echoing, glasses clinking in toasts. It all formed a symphony of life that seemed to have no room for me. I felt small like an intruder, but I kept going. After all, I had already lost too much to allow fear to steal that moment from me as well. I looked around the room and suddenly saw them. My children, my grandchildren, all gathered around a large table, the most cheerful one in the place. My heart leaped, and my chest ached as if I'd been punched. They were there, laughing, exchanging glances, experiencing what should have been mine too. The shock made me hold my breath. I wanted to cry, but I didn't. I held back the tears like someone holding on to their dignity. For a moment, I stood motionless, watching from afar. It was like watching a play where I no longer had a role. I, who had so often been the center of the stage, was now just an unwanted audience. The sound of one of them laughing pierced the room and tore my heart in two. And I thought, how is it possible that I am so invisible to those who were born of me? A wave of memories hit me. I saw each of them as children, running into my arms, begging for a hug, asking for protection. And now, as adults, they seem to have erased every chapter of that story with a cruel eraser. The invisibility I felt hurt more than any insult. Being forgotten is a silent violence. The waiter hurried past me, barely noticing me. The scene seemed to repeat itself everywhere. I was a shadow, someone who didn't belong there. That's when I raised my head. If the whole world pretended not to see me, I would grant myself the right to be seen. I didn't need invitations, I didn't need permission. And so, standing before the door I had already left behind, I realized the true weight wasn't on it, but on me. Now I was already inside. The next step would be to face the gaze of the one who had disowned me. And that would be the most silent, yet also the most powerful, confrontation of my life. I took a few steps toward their table, but no one noticed me. They were too busy laughing, toasting, immersed in a world where I no longer existed. I stood there, a few feet away, and it was as if I'd become a ghost, present, yet ignored. It's a strange pain. You breathe, walk, take up space, and yet it's as if you were air. I observed them one by one, and every detail stung like a needle. The daughter I'd rocked so many nights now spoke loudly, telling stories as if she owned the night. The eldest son, the one who'd once promised to take care of me, laughed carefree, without looking around. And the grandchildren, whom I'd played with so often in the yard, didn't even remember the old woman who still existed outside. I stood before them, and yet I wasn't there. The sound of their laughter pierced me like knives. I remembered the echo of their laughter when they were children. It was music that lulled me. It was the reward for my sacrifices. But that night, each laugh seemed to mock my absence, as if to say, "Without you, life goes on." And it did. Only without me. My eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let them fall. I swallowed them, as I had so many times in the past. A mother learns early on to swallow her tears so as not to worry her children. Only now there was no one to worry about. I could cry out loud in the middle of the room, and they still wouldn't notice. Invisibility is a soundless scream. As I watched them, I remembered when everyone depended on me. I was the center, the foundation, the guiding light. Today, it seemed like I was just leftovers. And I wondered, does every mother, at some point, become invisible to her own children? Is this the inevitable fate of those who give everything? The question pounded inside me like a hammer. Soft music began to play in the background, and the contrast tore me apart. That song had been the soundtrack to a party we had played years ago. I could almost picture the scene, me at the stove, them dancing in the living room, asking for more food, more stories, more of me. Now, the same song was playing at a party, without me. It was cruel how life likes to repeat songs in opposite settings. I stood, motionless, watching them as if I were a spectator at a play. Only this was my play, written with my sweat, with my sacrifices. And yet I no longer had a right to the stage. It was as if they'd erased me from the script. Invisible. The word burned inside me like a hot iron. For a moment, I considered giving up, slipping out quietly, returning home, and accepting my place in oblivion. But something inside me revolted. An ancient force, born of all the struggles I'd faced, rose up like a wall. No. I wouldn't be a ghost on the stage of the life I'd built. It was at that moment that I took a deep breath and raised my head. If they couldn't see me, I would try to get their attention myself. The silence had already screamed too much inside me. And that night, it would start screaming outside. With slow steps, I moved forward a little further until I was close enough that if even one of them looked up, they would see me. But they didn't. Not yet. And it was precisely in this absence that I felt the courage grow for the next gesture. The scene before me seemed to mock my pain. They laughed loudly, toasted, clinked their glasses on the table, as if nothing was missing. I watched, my eyes brimming with tears, until I felt a strange wave inside my chest. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't anger, it was something different, something born from the mixture of pain and courage. And before I could stop it, a laugh escaped my lips. It wasn't a sweet laugh, nor a joyful one. It was a firm, dry, almost ironic laugh. A laugh that didn't ask permission, that needed no explanation. It rang out loud enough to cross the room and blend in with the hubbub of voices. Some customers stopped eating and turned to look at me. It was at that moment that the invisible began to become visible. I surprised myself. I've never been one for scandals. I've always preferred silence to confrontation. But that laugh, oh, that laugh wasn't scandal. It was liberation. It was the sound of an old woman tired of being a shadow, of being a faded memory. And suddenly, I realized it wasn't me laughing at them, but at the situation. I was laughing at the cruel irony of having given everything and received nothing. It didn't take long for my children to notice. At first, They looked sideways, trying to feign indifference. Then, little by little, discomfort began to set in. The laugh I let out wasn't just any laugh. It was a reminder. It was as if I were saying without words, "I'm still here." The silence that followed between them was louder than my laughter. Some customers whispered among themselves. I could feel their gazes weighing heavily on my back. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't lower my head. I kept my chin up, let that laughter echo within me, and silently thought, "Now you see me, whether you like it or not." It's funny how a simple gesture can change the entire atmosphere. Before, I was an ignored figure. After the laughter, it was impossible to continue pretending I didn't exist. I had broken the barrier of invisibility. And, even though it hurt, it brought me a strange sense of victory. I remembered when my children were little, and I would laugh out loud to mask the hardships. How many times had I laughed at my own misery just so they would believe life was easy? Now, many years later, that laughter had a different purpose. It wasn't to protect them. It was to protect myself from disappearing. Shame began to spread across their table like a shadow. I saw exchanged glances, restless hands, glasses hastily dropped. They knew I was there. They could no longer deny it. I was no longer the silence sitting in the corner. I was the laughter that cut through the air. And it was in that moment, with my chest still vibrating from the sound I'd made, that I decided laughing wasn't enough. I had to act. If laughter had gotten attention, now I needed to be heard. The next step would be even bolder, and deep down I already knew what it would be. After my laughter, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. My children lowered their eyes, disconcerted, and I felt a strength grow within me. It was as if I had finally broken the barrier of invisibility. But being seen wasn't enough. I wanted to be heard. I wanted each of them and everyone present to know that I still exist. I called the waiter over with a calm but firm gesture. He approached, somewhat confused, perhaps expecting me to ask for a menu or complain about something. I bowed slightly and, in a clear voice, asked, "Please call the restaurant owner for me." The young man's eyes widened, surprised by the request, and he nodded silently before walking away. At that moment, I felt the eyes burning into me. Some customers whispered curiously, and my children, oh, they shifted restlessly in their chairs. They didn't know what to think. Me, the forgotten mother, asking for the restaurant owner? They must have felt embarrassed, perhaps afraid of what I would say. But it didn't matter. I was no longer there to spare them. As I waited, my hands rested firmly on my bag. Inside, my heart was pounding, as if it were about to explode. But outwardly, I remained calm. I'd learned this my whole life. Hold back the tears, hold back the anger, swallow the pain. Only this time, it wasn't the silence of submission. It was the silence of preparation. I knew something big was about to happen. I glanced at my children. Some looked away, others tried to look at me, but soon gave up. It was impossible to sustain their own mistakes in the face of my firmness. I didn't need to say anything yet. The simple gesture of calling the owner had already created an invisible earthquake at that table. The waiter returned and announced that the owner was on his way. My entire body trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. Who would have thought that, on that night of exclusion, I would become the protagonist of a scene no one would forget? It was as if fate had set a stage, and I, without any rehearsal, was the leading actress. The customers remained attentive. I felt as if my every move was being watched, as if everyone was waiting to see what that old woman would do. And for the first time in years, I didn't mind. On the contrary, I let their stares strengthen me. I wanted them to see. I wanted them to witness. As I waited, I remembered how many times I'd called attention to myself just to protect my children. Look at him, he's hardworking, I'd say to teachers. Give her a chance, she's responsible, I'd plead at jobs. I'd spent my entire life interceding for them. And now, for the first time, I was calling attention to myself. Time seemed to slow until I saw a tall, respectful man approach. It was the owner. He walked toward me with firm steps, and the eyes of the room followed him, as if announcing something important. My heart pounded, my hands sweated, but my eyes remained fixed. And it was at that moment, when the owner stopped before me and asked in a calm voice, "Is there anything you want?" that I realized that night would not end in silence. It would end in revelation. When the owner stood before me, the entire restaurant seemed to plunge into a different atmosphere. The voices that had previously echoed excitedly now slowly fell silent, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. I didn't say anything right away. I just took a deep breath and kept my eyes fixed on him. The silence that formed was so heavy it could almost be cut with a knife. My children, seated at the table, stood motionless. None of them dared raise their voices, not even to change the subject. The laughter that had previously filled the room had suddenly died. It was as if everyone there understood that something was about to happen, something that could no longer be swept under the rug. The owner, sensing the mood, remained respectful. He asked calmly, "Can I help you?" His voice was firm but also welcoming, as if he already sensed this was no ordinary request. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence work for me, because sometimes silence speaks louder than 1,000 words. I looked around and saw customers watching intently, waiters standing discreetly in corners. Even the background music seemed to have receded. I was at the center of it all. And inside, I felt a strange mix of vulnerability and power. Vulnerability, because I was just a forgotten old woman. Power, because even so, everyone was looking at me. My eyes slowly returned to my children's table. One by one, I stared at those faces that had once been so dependent on me. Some lowered their heads, others looked away. None met my gaze. The silence that hung over them was the cruelest proof of the guilt they tried to hide. I thought about speaking, about pouring out the full weight of pent-up pain, but I held myself back. Sometimes silence is more embarrassing than words. So I just stood there, breathing deeply, letting each second of silence be a mirror held up to them. And how it hurt to see the shame reflected on their faces. The owner waited patiently. His respect was almost palpable. He didn't insist, he didn't rush, he just waited. And in that gesture, I understood that for the first time that night, someone recognized me without me having to explain. Someone saw more in me than just any old lady. That gave me strength. While all this was happening, I remembered how many times I kept quiet for fear of creating conflict in the family. I swallowed words, endured slights, accepted slights. But there, in front of everyone, silence was no longer submission. It was confrontation, a silent but devastating confrontation. Finally, I lifted my face and let the silence speak for me. I didn't need to accuse, I didn't need to raise my voice. Just being there, in front of everyone, was enough for my children to know that night wouldn't end as they'd planned. And it was in that suffocating silence, more eloquent than any speech, that I realized the weight was no longer on me. It was on them. The owner was looking at me with a look I hadn't seen in a long time. Respect. It wasn't pity. It wasn't curiosity. It was something deeper. The way he looked at me, with both firmness and gentleness, reminded me how looks can carry more weight than words. I, who had so often been treated as invisible, now felt like someone truly saw me. He stepped a little closer, bowing his head slightly, as if recognizing something others couldn't see. I almost shivered. It was strange to feel that kind of reverence in a room where, minutes before, I'd been nothing more than a shadow. And it was in that sudden shift that I realized perhaps that night still had surprises in store for me. The surrounding diners watched everything in silence, trying to understand. And my children, disconcerted, shifted around the table, unable to say anything. I saw the unease in their eyes, as if they couldn't bear the thought of seeing me at the center of so much attention. It was as if the world had turned upside down, and I, the forgotten one, was now the center of attention. The owner, in a calm voice, repeated, "Can I help you?" But this time, there was something in his intonation that made me believe he wasn't just asking out of politeness. There was sincerity, a hidden recognition, as if somehow he already knew who I was even without me saying so. My heart raced, and a vague memory began to flicker in my mind. An old, childlike face, lost in time. It was just a spark, not yet clear, but enough to awaken something within me. I wondered silently, "Have we met before?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at him, searching the lines of his face for some trace of the past. The wrinkles time had carved into him were different, but there was something in his gaze, his posture, that felt familiar. And, without realizing it, I sensed that my silence intrigued him as well. Meanwhile, the atmosphere grew heavier. I could hear the clink of glasses slowly being placed on the surrounding tables, as if everyone was waiting for a secret to be revealed. The air seemed thicker, and even the background music had become a distant whisper. I was standing in the center of a makeshift stage. I thought again about the irony of life. I'd spent decades unrecognized, and now, in a restaurant full of strangers, I was receiving a look that restored my dignity. And the strangest thing, it wasn't coming from my children. It came from a man who, until then, had been a virtual stranger. This pained and comforted me at the same time. When the owner smiled faintly, I realized he knew more than he let on. It wasn't an ordinary smile. It was a smile filled with memories. And even without hearing anything, I sensed something important was about to be revealed. And it was in that instant, faced with that respectful and mysterious gaze, that I knew for sure I hadn't been brought there by chance. Fate was about to reveal a long-kept truth to me. When he held that smile, a flash of memory flashed through my mind like a brief bolt of lightning. It wasn't clear, but there was something there that pulled me back to a long time ago. The owner tilted his head and said softly, almost like a secret, "You don't remember me, do you?" The question echoed inside me, opening old drawers of memory I'd already locked away. I swallowed hard. My gaze traveled over the lines of his face, the marks of time, the firm posture, the respectful manner. Nothing came to me immediately, but there was a strange sense of familiarity, like when you dream of someone and, upon waking, are certain you've seen them somewhere before. My mind knew, but my heart was slow to catch up. He didn't wait for me to respond. In a calm but emotionally charged tone, he continued, "I was just a boy when you came into my family's life. You helped my mother at a time when no one else wanted to help." His words pierced me like a knife. The silence in the room, once again, weighed even more heavily. I felt my legs tremble. How could this man, the owner of a respected restaurant, be talking about me? I searched my memories for answers. And then, as if a curtain had been pulled back, the image appeared, a thin, haggard woman knocking on my door with a boy by the hand. She was shivering from the cold. His eyes were sunken, hungry, but still bright. My heart raced. Yes, I remembered. It was a rainy afternoon, and I barely had any food at home, but I shared what I had. I gave her clothes, a hot meal, and found a way to get medicine when the boy got sick. I didn't think twice. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I did it because my mother's heart couldn't refuse help. The owner stared at me, and in his eyes I saw the reflection of that boy who had once walked into my kitchen hand in hand with his mother. The same frightened look, only now filled with determination. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The past had returned, before me, in the form of a man I had never forgotten. My children, at the table, shifted restlessly. It was clear they didn't understand anything. I saw the silent question in their eyes. What is he talking about? And while I was moved by the revelation, I also felt the pain of realizing they had never known this side of my story. I looked down, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. I didn't want to appear fragile, but there was no holding back. The memory of that hungry boy, now a successful man, was too strong. It was as if life was showing me that nothing we do with love is ever lost. When I looked up again, he smiled again and said, I never forgot. You were the one who planted the seed that brought me here. His words, spoken in front of everyone, felt like a revelation and a tribute. And I, my heart pounding with emotion, knew that the threads of the past were still alive, intertwined with the present that now unfolded before me. His words tugged at my memories like a thread forgotten at the bottom of a drawer. I clearly saw the scene before me, a thin, haggard woman, with sunken eyes and rain-soaked clothes. She was holding that frail boy by the hand, who now stood before me, transformed into the owner of a respected restaurant. I remembered how her hands trembled when she asked for help, as if she were ashamed to admit the need. I myself had little back then. The pantry was small, the cupboards nearly bare, and yet I didn't hesitate. I prepared a bowl of hot soup, cut off chunks of bread, and pushed it in front of her. I remember saying, It's not much, but it's from the heart. And how the boy's eyes lit up when he smelled the food. It warmed my soul in a way no luxury in the world could have. The owner, now a grown man, told the same story in a firm voice, in front of everyone. My mother never forgot that gesture. You were the one who made her believe there was still kindness in the world. And I've never forgotten the face of the person who treated us with dignity when no one else would lend a hand. His words hit me hard, like a wave crashing without warning. My children, sitting at the table, exchanged uneasy glances. I saw the surprise and confusion on their faces. They had never heard this story.
How could they?
I never told them. Mothers keep so many things hidden, so much pain, so many sacrifices. I didn't need them to know. I did what I did because it was right, not because I was seeking applause. But now, the revelation hit them like a truth impossible to ignore. The entire room fell silent. It was as if every customer, every employee, had stopped to listen. The room breathed reverence, and I, accustomed to the silence of invisibility, found myself at the center of a scene I never imagined I would experience. It was strange to be celebrated for something that, for me, had always been natural, giving what little I had never felt heroic. It was simply love. As he spoke, I saw flashes of the past, his mother thanking him with tears, the boy smiling shyly with a piece of bread in his hands, my heart filling with a silent peace. It was all so vivid it felt like it had happened yesterday. And now, decades later, that gesture was returning, multiplied, before everyone. Tears escaped me, this time without me being able to hold them back. They streamed down my wrinkled face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of remembrance, of relief. I'd always believed that everything given with love returns in some way. And here was living proof. The owner, overcome with emotion, made a point of saying loudly so everyone could hear, "I wouldn't be who I am if it weren't for this woman. This house wouldn't exist without the seed she planted." His words echoed through the room like church bells, calling everyone to witness that truth. My children shrank even more at the table. I saw in them not only shame, but also bewilderment. They were encountering, perhaps for the first time, a part of my story they hadn't known. A part that showed who I'd always been, not the forgetful old woman, but the woman who always gave, even when she had none. And it was at that moment that I realized life has a curious way of revealing what needs to be revealed. Had the woman I helped once forgotten me? Perhaps. But her son never did. And now, in front of everyone, that memory returned to illuminate the darkest night of my life. When the owner finished speaking, silence spread through the room like a wave that drowns out all sound. I slowly turned my face toward my children's table. What I saw hurt more than any words. They didn't know what to do. They stood there, motionless, huddled, staring at their plates as if they wanted to hide inside them. The weight of the revelation was too great to ignore. The eldest, always so sure of himself, fidgeted with his napkin nervously, as if searching for a way out of a doorless maze. His daughter, who had been speaking loudly minutes before, now kept her eyes lowered, not daring to look me in the eye. The youngest bit his lip, restless, as if struggling between embarrassment and the urge to speak. Neither of them opened their mouths. Not one. It was strange to see them like this. I, who had so often seen them face the world with courage, now saw them defeated by silence. Perhaps because silence leaves no room for excuses. There was no possible lie, no plausible justification. What the owner had revealed was unquestionable. Their forgotten mother had been a pillar in the life of someone they didn't even know. I felt my chest tighten, not just from the pain, but from the irony. I spent decades dreaming of my children's recognition, hoping that one day they would see how much I had done for them. And in the end, that recognition came from a stranger who remembered every gesture, while my own children didn't even remember to invite me to dinner. I stared at them for a long moment. I waited for one of them to stand up, to at least have the decency to face me. But nothing. The embarrassment was so great that it kept them tied to their chairs like invisible chains. I saw in them not only shame, but also the childish resistance of those who refused to admit their mistake. The entire room watched. People whispered, some shook their heads in disapproval, others just looked on in pity. I knew each look was a further burden on my children, but it wasn't me who condemned them. It was their own actions that spoke louder. It was at that moment that I realized something painful but true. Sometimes, children need to be confronted by the gaze of others to understand the value of a mother. Alone, I never would have been able to do it. But there, in front of this unexpected audience, they were being forced to see. I swallowed hard. I didn't want to break down in tears in front of them. I wanted to maintain the dignity that night, curiously, had restored to me. I kept my posture straight, my eyes steady, as if unwilling to flinch in the face of oblivion. My children, however, remained speechless. And in that heavy silence, I realized, even if they tried to hide, the time for apologies was coming. Soon the mask would fall. The owner took a deep breath and, after a moment of respectful silence, turned to me. With an elegant gesture of his hand, he said in a firm but gentle voice, "You will not stand. A woman like you deserves more than that. Come with me." And, without waiting for a response, he pointed to the center of the room, where the brightest table was, the one everyone could see. I felt my heart race. My steps, which had previously been hesitant, now gained firmness. I walked slowly, each step echoing on the floor like a hammer on an anvil. The entire room followed suit. The customers looked at me with respect, some even smiling discreetly, as if witnessing something grand. I, who had entered like a shadow, now walked through the restaurant like a queen. I passed my children's table. I didn't look directly at them, but I felt the weight of their eyes burning into my back. Some fidgeted, others pretended to drink water. Their silence was louder than any half-baked excuse. They knew there was no way to erase what was already happening. The owner stopped before the best table in the house, impeccably white tablecloth, crystal glasses reflecting the light, tall candles, and fresh flowers in the center. With a smile full of reverence, he pulled out my chair. It was at that moment that my legs nearly gave out. How many times had I pulled out chairs for others? How many times had I served without expecting anything in return? And now, for the first time, someone was doing it for me. I sat down slowly, adjusting my coat over my shoulders. I said nothing, just took a deep breath. The waiter hurried to bring the menu, but the owner interrupted. "Don't bring a menu. Today, she doesn't choose anything. Today, she's being honored. We'll serve the best we have." The sentence sounded like a decree. The entire room heard it. Some customers began to clap quietly. Others murmured words of admiration. I felt every glance upon me like falling petals, covering my old wounds. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. On the contrary, it was as if everyone saw me, everyone recognized me. My children, on the other side, were flushed with shame. It was impossible to hide it. The scene exposed them as nothing else could. The mother they had forgotten was the same one who now held the highest honor in the place. I saw in them not only guilt, but also a deep discomfort, as if they finally realized the gravity of what they had done. I shifted in my chair, looking around. The room seemed brighter, more alive. Not because the lights had changed, but because I had changed my seat. Sitting at that table was like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been buried by years of neglect. The owner, standing beside me, raised the glass of wine the waiter had just brought. "To this woman," he said, "who taught my mother dignity and, without knowing it, helped build this place. May everyone here know that this house is hers too." And it was in that unexpected toast, with discreet applause spreading throughout the restaurant, that I realized that night would not be remembered for the exclusion I suffered, but for the dignity I recovered. As soon as I sat down at the central table, I felt the atmosphere change completely. The customers began to whisper, leaning toward one another. It wasn't malicious gossip, but curiosity mixed with admiration. I heard fragments of sentences. "Who could she be? She must be someone important. Look at the way the owner treats her." The whispers spread like wind through dry straw, growing louder by the second. The soft music playing in the background seemed to have lost its intensity. The real sound of the restaurant was now the murmur coming from the neighboring tables. Everyone wanted to know who the old woman was who had suddenly taken the place of honor. I, who had so often been invisible, now became the talk of strangers. And, curiously, I felt no shame. I felt dignity. I glanced discreetly around. I saw an elegant lady discussing something with her husband and pointing at me. I saw young people whispering and smiling, not with irony, but with respect. Even a child, sitting near the window, watched me with wide eyes, as if spotting a heroine from a story. The recognition that had been missing at home now blossomed in every corner of that room. My children, however, were motionless. Their silence contrasted with the growing hubbub. I could feel the tension in their faces, the shame gnawing at them. There was no hiding it. They were the children of the now celebrated woman, and everyone was beginning to realize it. Their embarrassment was evident, as if with every whisper the invisible finger of society was pointing at them. I myself was surprised by the serenity that was taking hold of me. In another time, I might have shrunk back, tried to escape the exposure. But not that night. That night, every whisper was like balm on my wounds. It was the universe telling me, "You haven't been forgotten. You were just being saved for the right moment." The owner, standing beside me, watched everything in silence as well. His gaze conveyed confidence, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. And I, who had so often feared being judged, this time accepted the judgment, because that judgment was, finally, one of recognition. The waiters began to move slowly, almost ceremoniously. They placed plates and glasses on the surrounding tables, but always glanced in my direction. It was as if even their work had acquired a new rhythm. The evening, once ordinary, was transformed into a spectacle. I could even hear the clatter of silverware fading. People chewed slowly, afraid to miss any words that might be said. The room had become a stage, and every whisper was part of the chorus accompanying my story. I didn't need to say anything. The simple fact of being there, occupying that place, was already an answer to all exclusion. The whispers, instead of diminishing me, elevated me. And I, who had so often feared being forgotten, began to understand that fate had its own way of giving me back what had been taken from me. And it was in this growing hubbub, a mix of curiosity and respect, that I realized the truth was about to be served. Not on plates, but in words that would echo like a banquet for all. As whispers spread through the room, my eyes inevitably sought out my children's table. The contrast was stark. Everyone around was curious, attentive, filled with admiration. But they were sunk in silence, each trapped in their own shame. I saw the restless fingers, the shifting glances, the hands fiddling with a napkin aimlessly. It was shame squeezing, crushing, suffocating. The older man, who always liked to appear firm, now had a pale face. He kept his eyes fixed on his plate, as if the rice and beans were more interesting than the grand scene unfolding before him. I knew him well. That silence wasn't calm. It was escape. It was a desperate attempt to hide within his own rigidity. My daughter, the one who had so often raised her voice against me in the past, could now barely lift her chin. Her eyes were watering, but not from pretty emotion, but from the pressure of being exposed. She bit her lip, as if holding back a cry of anger and embarrassment. For the first time, I saw in her the same feeling I had so often felt, that of not having a place at the table. The youngest, always more sensitive, seemed torn. His eyes darted from my table to theirs, restless, as if he were struggling inside. He still didn't have the courage to stand up, but it was clear something was eating away at him. The shame in him wasn't just due to the judgment of others, it was also due to the weight of his conscience. The entire room seemed to point at them without needing words. They weren't aggressive looks, but the comparison was enough. The honored mother in the center and the children wilting in the corner. It was as if each whisper was a mirror held up before them, reflecting the ingratitude they tried to hide. And from where I was, I didn't need to raise my voice. My presence was enough. I just needed to occupy that space to make them feel small. Not because I wanted to humiliate them, but because the truth has this power. It exposes without shouting. I felt my heart ache. I won't deny it. Part of me wanted to see them like this, confronted, forced to swallow the shame they'd so often made me feel. But another part, the mother who never ceases to exist, suffered seeing them cowering. A mother's love is this paradox. It hurts to be hurt, and it also hurts to see her child bleed, even when he deserved it. The owner, sensing the mood, stood erect beside me, like a guardian. He knew he didn't need to say anything at that moment. The silence spoke for me, spoke for him, and even spoke for the past. It was a silence that allowed no breaks, that offered no excuses. And my children, caught between the weight of others' gaze and their own conscience, had nowhere to run. There was no laughter to hide, no glasses to raise. There was only shame, that bitter companion that settles in the chest when the truth knocks on the door. And it was in this contrast between silent applause and bowed heads that I understood. Shame is the first step toward change, but it can also be the last refuge of cowardice. And I needed to wait to find out which of the two paths my children would choose. The owner took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, and took a few steps forward. The room, already in a respectful silence, seemed to hold its breath. He raised his voice, not authoritatively, but with the firmness born of truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "there are stories that cannot remain hidden, and there are people who deserve to be recognized in life. This woman sitting here is one of those people." Conversations ceased completely. The sound of silverware, the clinking of glasses, even the footsteps of the waiters, everything stopped. I, who had spent my life shrinking to avoid attention, was now the center of everyone's attention. I felt my heart pounding, but I didn't look away. If fate had placed me there, I wouldn't back down. The owner continued, "Many here don't know, but when I was just a boy, my mother and I had nothing. It was this woman, whom you see now, who gave us food, clothing, and hope. She was the one who made us believe there was still good in this world. If I'm here today, if this restaurant exists, it's because one day she reached out when everyone else turned away." His words echoed like thunder throughout the room. I saw customers tear up. I saw couples exchange surprised glances. I even saw waiters standing there with discreet tears in their eyes. And I, in the center of that revelation, felt the weight of memory transform into wings. It was as if all that pain, kept hidden in silence, was finally being washed away before the world. My children were pale. The eldest pressed his lips together, his daughter stared at the floor, and the youngest hid his face in his hands. They couldn't deny it. There was no excuse. The owner's speech was indisputable because it came from someone who owed me nothing. It was the pure truth, laid bare for all to see. The owner then raised his wine glass and concluded, There is no family, business, or society that thrives without gratitude. And if there's one thing the world needs to learn, it's that we don't turn our backs on those who once supported us. Today, before you, I honor this woman as a symbol of respect and dignity. May this restaurant always be remembered not only for the food, but for the memory of the gesture that allowed us to exist. A loud applause erupted in the hall. The clapping echoed like rain on a rooftop, continuous, intense. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or close my eyes to believe. The sound of clapping hands was the answer life owed me. Each clap seemed to say, "We see you. We recognize you." The tears streamed freely down my face. I didn't try to hide them. They weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of victory. My heart, so often crushed, now filled like an overflowing cup. I never imagined hearing such a speech, much less in public. But it was there, in front of strangers, that the truth finally blossomed. My children, however, cowered even more. It wasn't just shame now. It was the realization that their ingratitude was being exposed for all to see. Their owner's speech wasn't just uplifting me, it was also confronting them. And deep down I knew, from that point on, there was no escaping the truth. And it was in that moment, amidst applause and tears, that I understood. The banquet that night was not in the steaming dishes, but in the words of gratitude that had fed my hungry soul for so many years. Immediately after the speech, the waiters began to move as if attending a ceremony. None of them hurried. Each step was calculated. Each gesture carried a silent reverence. They brought out the finest china, gleaming silverware, crystal glasses that sparkled in the yellow light of the room. I had never seen so much care lavished on me. It was as if, suddenly, every detail was a way of saying, "You are important." One of the waiters, young and visibly moved, placed before me a plate that looked like a work of art. He looked me in the eye and said, with a small smile, "It's an honor to serve you." That simple phrase echoed within me like a chant. How many times have I served unnoticed? How many times have I prepared invisible banquets for my children without ever hearing a word like that? And now, a stranger was saying it with such respect. I felt my hands tremble as I touched the cutlery, not from the weight of the metal, but from the weight of the moment. I remembered the countless times I'd eaten what was left after everyone else was full. I remembered the nights I'd preferred to go to bed hungry so they wouldn't notice how little there was. And, ironically, now I was being served as the guest of honor. The next waiter brought the wine and carefully filled my glass. With each drop, it felt like dignity returned to my chest. The crystal reflected the light, reminding me of how I'd so often raised cheap glasses to toast achievements that belonged only to others. Now, for the first time, there was a toast that was also mine. The hall remained in respectful silence. It wasn't the cold silence of indifference, but the solemn silence of reverence. I could sense in the eyes surrounding me a genuine recognition. It wasn't curiosity, it was honor. The forgotten mother, became there a symbol of something greater, a value that should never have been denied. I turned my gaze to my children's table. They watched the scene like embarrassed spectators. Every waiter who approached me felt like a silent accusation against them. The mother who hadn't earned an invitation was now receiving the most honorable service in the restaurant. And they knew everyone around them saw it. With each dish served, a memory flooded back. I remember hot soup on cold days, rice stretched with water to make it last, bread cut into four. None of it was glamorous, but all of it was filled with love. And now, Faced with such abundance served with honor, I realized the world had a peculiar way of restoring what seemed lost. The owner, standing, observed every detail. His eyes shone with a mixture of pride and gratitude. He didn't need to say anything, his silence was tribute enough. I knew this gesture wasn't just for me, but also for his mother, who was surely smiling from somewhere as she watched the return of the favor. I took the first sip of wine slowly, letting the warm liquid slide down my throat. It wasn't just wine, it was memory, it was recognition, it was liquid justice coursing through me. I felt my eyes fill with tears again, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of triumph. And in that moment, before the brightest table, served with honor and looked upon with respect, I realized that night was giving me back not only my dignity, but also the right to exist aloud. I was no longer a shadow. I was a presence. The silence that reigned in the hall was no longer one of anticipation, but of reverence. Sitting at the brightest table, served like a queen, I felt within me an ancient force that had lain dormant for years. And it was in that moment that I understood. It was my turn to speak. I couldn't let that night pass without my voice echoing. I rested my hands on the table, took a deep breath, and lifted my face. I looked around at the customers, the waiters, the owner who watched me silently, and finally at my children, who still cringed in shame. My words came out slowly but firmly. I spent my life serving, caring, giving of myself until there was nothing left. I never expected applause, never asked for recognition. I just wished a mother's presence would be enough. But often it wasn't. The room remained quiet, absorbing every syllable. I saw some clients lean forward, as if they didn't want to miss a sentence. I continued. I was invisible when I was tired, forgotten when I was present, silent when I wanted to speak. And yet I continued, because this is what being a mother is, giving, even when the world doesn't give back, loving, even when gratitude isn't enough. The memories came rushing back, and my voice began to tremble. I worked until my hands bled, cooked when there was almost nothing left, dressed each of you in clothes I sewed at night. I did it all in silence, because I believed that one day you would understand. Today I see. Maybe it took you too long to see. My words weren't an accusation, but a revelation. I spoke as if pouring out years of pent-up silence. And the more I spoke, the more the weight inside me lifted. I saw teary eyes among the customers. I saw the owner nod, and even the waiters stopped to listen. It was as if the entire restaurant had become my living room, and everyone there was witness to what I needed to say. I looked at my children firmly and added, I don't want to punish you. I don't want you to kneel before me. I just want you to understand that time is cruel, and that one day it may be too late to recognize what a mother means. Your silence was the most painful wound. But know this, the dignity I regained here tonight, no one can take from me again. I felt my voice crack, but I didn't shut up. I don't want gold, I don't want gifts. What a mother wants is respect. And respect can't be bought, improvised, or asked for at the last minute. Respect is presence. Respect is remembering. Respect is not excluding those who gave their lives for you. Some people began to clap slowly, spontaneously, while I was still speaking. It wasn't show-off applause. It was genuine agreement. I closed my eyes for a moment and felt the sound penetrate me like medicine, healing wounds I'd already believed incurable. Finally, I lifted my chin and concluded, if this night served any purpose, let it serve as a reminder to everyone here Never fail to honor those who gave you everything without asking for anything in return. Because when ingratitude replaces gratitude, life becomes a set table, but empty. And when I finished, the entire room gave a standing ovation. I didn't need anything else. My voice had been heard. As soon as my words died away, I turned to my children. They were different. The silence was no longer just shame. It was a deep discomfort, burning inside. I saw in their eyes the reflection of burning consciences, as if each sentence I uttered had lit a fire difficult to extinguish. They could no longer pretend. The weight of the truth crushed them before everyone's eyes. The older man, who had remained rigid until then, began rubbing his face with his hands, as if trying to extinguish something that insistently burned inside. I saw his breathing heavy, his eyes watering despite himself. He, who had always wanted to appear strong, was being consumed by a force greater than any pride, his conscience. My daughter's gaze remained downcast, but her fingers trembled on the table. She bit her lip, her trembling chin betraying the effort to hold back tears. For the first time in a long time, I saw her without a mask. She wasn't the tough woman who had so often raised her voice to me. She was simply a daughter who, deep down, knew she had failed. The youngest, always the most sensitive, seemed the most affected. His eyes darted from me to the owner, from the customers to his brothers, as if searching for a way out that didn't exist. With each passing moment, he seemed smaller, more vulnerable, until he lowered his head and let a tear fall. He said nothing, but the gesture spoke louder than 1,000 words. And as I looked at them, I felt a mixture of pain and justice. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't pleasure in seeing them embarrassed. It was simply the realization that, finally, they were feeling a little of what they'd so often made me feel, the weight of being forgotten. The entire room noticed it too. People looked at my children not with anger, but with silent disapproval. It was as if everyone there were invisible judges, forcing them to face the mirror they so avoided. And that mirror was me, sitting with dignity in the center of the restaurant. I felt my heart ache. I didn't want to destroy them. I just wanted them to understand. But I realized that sometimes awareness needs to burn like coals for change to happen. Without pain, there is no transformation. And that night, pain was etched in their every gesture. The owner, still beside me, sensed the mood and said nothing. He simply placed his hand on the back of my chair, offering silent support. It was as if to say, "Let the weight do its work. Silence is correcting what words couldn't." Meanwhile, a strange feeling washed over me. I no longer felt alone. The entire restaurant seemed to be my witness, and my children, for the first time, had no place to hide. It was as if every glance around them was fire, and they, without realizing it, were being purified in the flame of truth. And it was in this contrast between my firmness and their shame that I realized the night was no longer just mine. Now it was theirs, too. The wound I carried was beginning to transform into healing, but that healing, before touching me, needed to first set their hearts ablaze. Just after that heavy silence that consumed my children, I heard the unexpected sound of applause. 1, 2, 3 people started slowly until the entire room joined in a firm, prolonged applause. I was startled at first, but soon realized it wasn't applause for pain or embarrassment.
It was applause for me.
For my story. For the value that, for so long, had been denied me. Strangers gave me a standing ovation, tears in their eyes and smiles of admiration. I saw couples rising to their feet, young people clapping enthusiastically, even children repeating the gesture without fully understanding it, but feeling the power of the moment. I, a forgotten old woman, was now celebrated as if I were a symbol of something greater, the dignity of a mother. The applause echoed through the hall like heavy rain pounding on the roof. Each clap was like medicine poured over my old wounds. It was as if life, through unknown hands, was giving me back what my children had stolen: recognition. And for the first time, I didn't fight the emotion. I let the tears flow freely. My children, however, sank even deeper into their chairs. I saw the discomfort, the shame, the disbelief on their faces. It was impossible to hide it. They were being confronted not only by me, but by the entire crowd, which, without knowing them, already knew of their ingratitude. The applause, to them, sounded like an accusation. I looked around and realized that, in that moment, I wasn't alone. Every person in the restaurant seemed to be with me, supporting me, defending me, as if they were witnesses to a lifetime of silence and sacrifice. It was as if, suddenly, I had gained a new family, made up of strangers who understood the value my own children had ignored. An elegant lady approached my table, placed her hand on my shoulder, and said, "You are an example to us all." Another person, a middle-aged man, spoke loudly, "Mothers are sacred. Those who do not honor theirs do not know gratitude." His words made the applause grow even louder until the entire room vibrated with an energy that seemed almost sacred. I never imagined I would experience something like this. I had spent my entire life invisible, and now I was seen by everyone. I had spent my entire life silent, and now my story echoed in voices and applause. It was a strange, almost surreal feeling, and at the same time profoundly just, because it wasn't vanity, it was truth. And truth has the power to lift even those who have been knocked to the ground. The owner, moved, also applauded. His eyes were teary, and in his gesture, I sensed not only personal gratitude, but also pride. He knew that this moment wasn't just mine. It belonged to all the forgotten mothers, all the invisible women. I was just the voice representing so many others. I felt a warmth rise in my chest, as if I were applauding myself from within. Because, more than the recognition of strangers, I finally recognized my own strength. I, who had so often doubted my worth, now saw it reflected in every raised hand, in every admiring glance. And it was in this sea of applause from people who had never seen me before that I learned a hard and beautiful lesson. Sometimes, the love we expect from those within comes from those without. But even so, it's still love. When the applause finally died down, silence returned to the room, but this time filled with anticipation. All eyes turned back to my children's table, which looked as if it were about to collapse. It was then that the oldest, breathing heavily and red-faced, stood up in a rush. His napkin fell to the floor, but he didn't even notice. With a trembling voice, he tried to speak. "Mom, you need to understand. I didn't mean any harm. We just—" He stuttered, stumbling over his own words, as if searching for a path that didn't exist. Each sentence he tried to construct dissolved into thin air. "I didn't mean to hurt. It's just busy life, commitments." But no one believed him.
Not me.
Not even him. The customers stared at him, some with raised eyebrows, others shaking their heads in silent disapproval. It was clear his excuse didn't hold water. The more he spoke, the more he contradicted himself, the more he revealed there was no possible excuse for their oversight. The silence between his sentences rang louder, than any words. I watched him calmly, without interrupting. I didn't need to. He was digging the hole he was sinking into himself. It was like watching someone trying to put out a fire by blowing with their mouth. The more they tried, the more they revealed the severity of the fire. And the fire, this time, was the truth. My daughter tried to help him. She touched his arm and added, "It was a misunderstanding, Mom. We were going to talk to you." But her voice broke mid-sentence, and she ended up swallowing the words. The stares around her were too heavy, and she knew nothing she said would have any effect. Silence once again fell. The youngest, embarrassed, just shook his head, unable to get up. He didn't try to justify himself. Perhaps because he knew it would be useless. Perhaps because he already felt the weight of regret in his heart. But his silence spoke volumes. It was the silent confession of someone who acknowledges their own guilt. The once lively room had now become a kind of invisible courtroom. Every customer was a witness, every waiter a silent judge. And the defendants were my own children, condemned not by my words, but by their own actions. I stood my ground, without raising my voice, without reacting. I just looked at them calmly, because sometimes you don't have to shout to be heard. The silence of dignity speaks louder than 1,000 defensive speeches. The restaurant owner, beside me, crossed his arms and watched silently. He knew the excuses were hollow. He knew that night still held more revelations in store. And I, with a heavy yet firm heart, also knew the worst was yet to come. And it was in that moment, amidst the confused words of my children and the silent judgment of those present, that I realized the truth cannot be hidden forever. It always finds a way to rise up. The restaurant owner, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. His expression was serious, but his eyes shone with quiet determination. He looked at me first, then at my children, and finally at everyone present. The entire room leaned in, as if sensing something important was about to be revealed. "There's something many here don't know," he began, his voice firm. "And perhaps not even this woman's children know. This restaurant, which is now known and respected, only exists because one day she reached out to us. It wasn't just food and clothing that we received. It was more. It was hope.
It was dignity.
It was the bridge that allowed us to cross the abyss." People held their breath. My children shifted in their seats, exchanging quick glances, unsure of what he was getting at. I widened my eyes in confusion. I remembered helping their mother, but I had no idea the magnitude of that gesture. The owner continued, "When my mother was on the verge of despair, without the strength to carry on, it was this woman who introduced her to an acquaintance who ended up offering her a job. And it was this job that gave us our first income. It was from there that my mother was able to save money and dream again. Years later, with great effort, that dream became the foundation of this restaurant. In other words, this place bears her mark. This place exists because one day she said yes when everyone else said no." A murmur of astonishment ran through the room. The customers looked at each other, moved. As I sat there, I felt the tears flow uncontrollably. I never imagined that such a simple, almost forgotten gesture would turn into something so big. I simply did what any mother would do, share what little I had. I didn't know that, in the future, this would sustain so many other lives. My children were stunned. The oldest was babbling nonsense, the daughter covered her mouth in shock, and the youngest stared at me, his eyes welling up, as if seeing me for the first time.
They didn't know this story.
They never knew, because I never told them. Not because it was a secret, but because I never thought it was necessary. For me, helping was natural, not newsworthy. The owner approached my table and added, "That's why today isn't just dinner. It's justice. This woman is part of the foundation of this place. Every dish we serve, every customer we welcome, carries a little of the seed she planted." The hall erupted in applause again, but this time it wasn't just admiration. It was reverence. Some people even stood to greet me from where they stood. I was so moved, I could barely breathe. It was as if life had opened an ancient book and shown me that no page of love is lost. My children, in front of everyone, had no more excuses. The truth enveloped them like a chain. They were exposed, not by my words, but by the voice of those who witnessed and lived the consequences of my actions. And there was no escape. And it was in that moment, amidst the applause and the revelation, that I understood. The truth, no matter how hidden it is, always finds a stage to reveal itself. After the owner's revelation, the entire salon seemed to have transformed into an invisible courtroom. There was no judge, no official sentence, but everyone knew what was happening. My children were in the dock, and the accusation came not from me, but from the weight of the truths that were now exposed before everyone. The stares were relentless. I saw couples whispering to each other, shaking their heads in disapproval. I saw young people murmuring indignantly, as if they couldn't believe their children were capable of such ingratitude. I even saw an older man, sitting in the back, discreetly wipe away a tear as he said in a low voice, "This is a disgrace." My children couldn't stand those looks. The oldest fidgeted with his napkin, folding and unfolding it as if he could hide in it. My daughter avoided all eye contact, staring at a distant spot on the wall. The youngest, red-faced, simply lowered his head, unable to bear his guilt. I didn't need to raise my voice or accuse them directly. Life was already doing that for me. The trial had no prepared witnesses, no lawyers, but it had the naked truth in front of everyone. And the truth, when revealed, weighs more than any sentence. I felt my heart sink. I never wanted to humiliate them. I never wanted to see them like this. But I also couldn't deny that there was a strange justice in that scene. It was as if, finally, they experienced a little of what I'd felt so many times. The weight of oblivion, the pain of being invisible, the shame of not being remembered. The restaurant owner, beside me, kept a serious expression, like a silent judge. He didn't need to say anything else. His revelation had already been enough to illuminate what was hidden. Now my children's silence spoke louder than any excuse. The salon was in suspense, as if everyone was awaiting the final sentence. But it wouldn't come from outside. It wouldn't come from me, nor from the owner, nor from the customers. The sentence had to be born within them, in the weight of their own conscience. And that weight, I could see, was already crushing their hearts. I took a deep breath and stood up straight, looking around. It wasn't a victory that filled me with pride. It was a victory that hurt. Because a mother never celebrates her children's downfall. But a mother also knows that sometimes they need to fall to understand the value of what they've lost. And it was in this courtroom without a judge, without written laws, but full of eyes and truths, that I realized fate had already given its verdict, and there was no way for them to escape. Then something happened that shattered the heavy silence of the restaurant. My youngest son, the youngest, could no longer contain himself. First, he shook his head slowly, as if trying to deny the inevitable. Then, he put his hands to his face and began to cry, loudly, uncontrollably, like a child. The sound of his weeping pierced the entire room, cutting the air like a sharp knife. People looked at each other, some sighed, others murmured words of sympathy. But I could only look at him, my grown boy, now reduced to the fragility I knew so well. It was like seeing him again as a small child, running into my arms, afraid to sleep alone. Only this time, the fear wasn't of imaginary monsters. It was of the real monster of guilt. He staggered to his feet, tears streaming uncontrollably down his face. "Mother, forgive me," he said between sobs, his voice broken and trembling. The entire room heard him, and the echo of that plea was like thunder within me. I'd waited my entire life for words like those. I waited in silence. I waited on lonely nights. I waited with tears hidden in my pillow. And now they were finally coming out in front of everyone. My other children stared at him in shock. The eldest hardened his expression, trying to hide his emotion, while my daughter bit her lip, trying not to cry too. But the youngest no longer had the strength to resist. He surrendered to repentance without masks, without pride, simply with a bare soul. My heart ached and warmed at the same time. It ached because I saw the weight of regret crushing my son. It warmed because, finally, I knew there was still something alive inside him, something that hadn't been completely extinguished by indifference. His crying was proof that there was still love, even lost amid ingratitude. I stood still for a few seconds, feeling the tears stream down my face as well. I didn't cry out of weakness. I cried because a part of me, wounded for so long, was beginning to be touched by the balm of regret. I wanted to hug him, but I knew that moment needed to be lived like this, raw, exposed, in front of everyone. The restaurant owner discreetly stepped away, as if realizing that moment wasn't his. The entire room remained silent, respectful, letting my son's cries echo uninterrupted. It was a sacred moment, painful and beautiful all at once. I looked at him steadily, never looking away, and let him feel the weight of what he had done. Not to punish him, but so he would never forget. Because true repentance is not born of words, but of the pain engraved in the heart. And in that moment, I saw that he was learning the lesson that life, until then, had tried in vain to teach. And so, in front of everyone, my youngest son cried like a child and asked for forgiveness from the mother he had forgotten. A moment that not only marked that night, but would forever be etched in the memories of all who witnessed it. He continued to cry before me, his trembling hands covering his face, his entire body overcome with regret. I felt my heart break in two, half wanting to run and hug him like I did when he was little, half wanting to leave him there so that the weight of guilt could truly transform him. Because I knew forgiveness given too quickly is lost just as quickly. I took a deep breath, wiped the tears from my face, and raised my head. Then I called his name, my voice firm but full of tenderness. He raised his red, desperate eyes, as if searching for a last ray of hope. That's when I said, "Forgiveness exists, my son, but it's not just words. Forgiveness only has value when it's accompanied by change." The entire room fell silent. Everyone listened. Everyone held their breath, as if those words were meant for them too. My other children, still seated, lowered their eyes even further. Perhaps they realized I wasn't just speaking to their youngest, but to everyone. I continued, "I don't want you to just apologize to me when you're feeling shame. I want you to respect me when no one's looking. I want you to invite me when there's no audience. I want you to remember me not just when the world demands it, but when your heart asks. That's change. That's true forgiveness. The youngest son cried even more, but now there was a different shine in his eyes. It was as if my words were hammering inside him, shattering his pride, shattering his indifference. I saw that he understood. I saw that somehow he was willing to change. My other children remained motionless, but the tension on their faces showed that every word hit them too. The oldest, his fist clenched, didn't dare look up. My daughter, biting her lip, had hidden tears she didn't want to let fall. Their shame was silent, but visible. I looked at all three of them and added, my voice lower but even more firmly, respect is the only gift a mother truly expects. I don't want flowers that wilt, nor gifts that break. I want actions. I want memories. I want presence. Because without them, forgiveness is just empty words. The restaurant owner, next to me, bowed his head in reverence. He understood. The customers understood, too. This wasn't just a message for my children, but for all who, at some point, forgot to appreciate those who silently supported them. And as I spoke, I realized it wasn't just me teaching. I dedicated my entire life to educating my children, but that night, I realized I was also educating a room full of strangers. And maybe, just maybe, I was educating even the tired heart that beat within me. After my words, the restaurant owners signaled to the waiters. They moved silently, carrying a tray covered with a silver bell. The entire room watched expectantly, as if it were part of a solemn ritual. The waiter placed the plate before me, and the owner, with a ceremonious gesture, removed the gleaming lid. The aroma that filled the air was indescribable. An elaborate, colorful dish, prepared with the finest ingredients in the house. But what surprised me most wasn't the food itself, but what the owner announced next. Starting today, this will be the most special dish on our menu, and it will be named after her. He pointed at me with a smile full of gratitude. The room erupted in applause, some diners even standing up for a closer look. I, stunned, put my hand to my mouth. I never imagined my name could be engraved on something so grand. I had spent my entire life preparing dishes no one remembered, simple dishes that disappeared from the plate without my effort being noticed. And now, an entire dish would bear my name in front of strangers. My children were completely silent. The oldest shook his head in disbelief. My daughter brought her hands to her face, trying to hide her tears. The youngest was still crying, but now it was a different kind, regret mixed with pride, as if he finally understood who I was and what I represented. The owner raised his voice again. This dish isn't just food. It's a tribute. It's a memory. It's a symbol of gratitude. Everyone who comes here to eat will know that it's only possible because this woman once shared what little she had. Her name will live forever in this house, as it deserves. The applause echoed again, louder than before, and I, unable to hold it back, let the tears flow freely. It was as if all the pain, all the lonely nights, all the forgotten memories were being washed away in that moment. I was no longer just an invisible old woman. I was part of the history of that place, immortalized in a gesture no one could erase. I remembered making soups with bones, stretching rice with water, inventing recipes to feed my children. All of this without a name, without recognition, without record. And now, ironically, a dish bearing my name would be served to strangers as a symbol of greatness. Life has these twists and turns that leave us breathless. I felt the owner's gaze rest on me, full of reverence. He knew what he was doing. It wasn't just about food. It was about justice. about giving back, in public, what had been silently denied to me. And I, with my heart overflowing, realized my name, so forgotten by my own people, would now be remembered by many. And in that moment, faced with that steaming dish and the unexpected tribute, I felt that life, somehow, had decided to immortalize me. I shifted in my chair, trying to contain the emotion that was sweeping over me. The people around me clapped, some even coming over to greet me. It was as if the entire room had transformed into a kingdom, and I was the unexpected queen of the night. There was no crown, no throne, but there was something much greater, the respect that had been denied me for so long. The waiters served the dish bearing my name with solemn care, as if offering a treasure. The wine was refilled in my glass with reverence, and each gesture instilled in me a sense of dignity I had forgotten existed. It was strange, almost surreal, to be treated this way after years of invisibility. But deep inside me, something whispered, "You deserve it." My children, still cowering, watched in silence. I saw a mixture of shame and amazement in them. Perhaps they had never imagined that the mother they had ignored could be celebrated in front of strangers. Perhaps they had never stopped to see the strength that lay within me. And now, forced to watch, they could not deny it. That night, I was greater than they had ever admitted. An elegant lady stood and raised her glass to me. To the mothers who never stop giving, even when they receive so little in return, she said firmly. Several patrons echoed the toast, and the sound of clinking glasses filled the room like music. I closed my eyes for a moment and let that melody heal me from within. The restaurant owner approached and placed his hand on my shoulder. "You're an inspiration," he said softly, so only I could hear. His words washed over me like a balm. I had spent my entire life inspiring in silence, sustaining lives without anyone noticing. And now, finally, the world recognized it. I felt time stand still. The pain of lonely nights, the wound of oblivion, everything seemed to dissolve before that scene. I knew the next day would bring back the routine, the challenges, perhaps even the neglect of my own. But in that moment, that night, I was queen. A queen crowned not by gold, but by dignity. As I looked around, I realized something curious. I didn't need luxury, I didn't need riches, I didn't need titles. Everything I ever wanted was there, condensed into looks of respect, sincere applause, and genuine recognition. It was little for some, but for me it was everything. My children, heads bowed, seemed dwarfed by the scene. But deep down I knew this wasn't just to exalt me.
It was to teach them.
The world was showing them, clearly, what it means to value a mother. Not with expensive gifts, but with gratitude. And it was like that, amid raised glasses, prolonged applause, and discreet tears, that I realized, that night, life had clothed me with the invisible crown of respect. And even if only for one night, I was truly queen. The evening was drawing to a close. The room, once just an ordinary restaurant, now seemed charged with something sacred. I looked around and saw emotional faces, people who had never met me but who were taking away a lesson. I also looked at my children, still downcast, overcome by the weight of their own conscience. And it was in this contrast that I felt the need to end it all with a single sentence. I took a deep breath, rested my hands on the table, and slowly stood up. The entire room fell silent once more. I walked a few steps, looked around, and, in a firm voice, thick with emotion, blurted out the words I'd been holding back for so long. A mother doesn't need gold, doesn't need palaces, doesn't need applause. All she needs is respect. And when children forget this, they don't just lose their mother, they lose themselves. The silence that followed was profound. It was as if each person there was reflecting on their own lives, on their own mothers, on the times they forgot to appreciate themselves. I myself felt the weight of the phrase echo within me, as if it were not just a message to my children, but to the entire world. I saw discreet tears in the eyes of strangers. I saw hands clasped at neighboring tables. I even saw some customers rising to their feet in respect. The owner, beside me, inclined his head, silently confirming that this was the truth that needed to be told. My children finally looked up. The eldest, his hard expression cracked with emotion. My daughter, crying openly. The youngest, still trembling, murmured softly, "Mom." And I, without adding anything else, just stared at them. Because there was no need for speeches. The lesson had been taught. I sat back down, and in that moment I no longer felt alone. I knew that life, with all its pain, had led me to this moment to give me back what had always been denied me. To be seen, to be remembered, to be honored. And so, on that night when I was forgotten by my family, the whole world reminded me who I was. And so that night ended, a night in which the pain of being forgotten was transformed into respect before everyone. But the truth is, it wasn't just my story that was exposed there. It was a portrait of many mothers who give their all and receive, in return, silence and indifference. How many times have you failed to appreciate the person who is always by your side? How many times have you believed you would have time, that you would recognize them later, and that later never came? Think about it. Time is relentless, and when we wake up, it may be too late. If this story resonated with you, don't ignore it. Honor those who deserve to be honored. Respect those who once carried your life on their shoulders without asking for anything in return. Because ingratitude exacts a high price, and no one emerges unscathed. Now tell me, if it had been your mother at that table, how would you have acted?